The sky above Avalon tore open without warning. Artoria had walked these mist-shrouded paths for what felt like centuries, though time moved differently here. The island existed between moments, a sanctuary carved from possibility rather than stone. She had kept her vigil with the discipline of the knight she had once been. Excalibur always at her side, its golden light a constant companion against the soft gray of eternal twilight. She noticed the wrongness before she saw it. The air grew thick, pressing against her skin like water. The mists that usually drifted with gentle purpose began to writhe, agitated by something beyond the veil of reality. Excalibur hummed in her grip, the blade's light flickering in warning. Then the sky split. Not a tear, not a wound, something worse. Reality itself seemed to scream as colors that had no name bled through the fracture in space. The sound was not sound, but pressure, a sensation that bypassed her ears and struck directly into her skull. She had felt the touch of magic before, had wielded powers that bent the world to her will. But this was different. This was raw. This was chaos given form without intention, destruction without malice. The warp storm. She knew the term without knowing how she knew it. The knowledge arrived with the horror downloaded directly into her consciousness, as if the universe itself was explaining what it was doing to her. The storm reached through dimensions she could not name and grasped her like a child plucking a flower from soft earth. Artoria tried to anchor herself. Her feet found no purchase. Her hands clutched Excalibur, but the blade that had cleaved through gods and monsters could not cut through this. The island beneath her dissolved into memory. Avalon, her sanctuary, the place where she had finally found something approaching peace after the long nightmare of Camelot, vanished behind a wall of impossible colors. She fell. Not down, not through. The directions had no meaning here. She tumbled through spaces between spaces where geometry held no authority and light moved in patterns that hurt to perceive. Her armor, the plates that had turned aside swords and arrows, and the claws of beasts burned cold against her skin. Each breath tasted of copper and ash. And something else, something that made her throat close with instinctive revulsion. Excalibur's light guttered like a candle in wind. The golden radiance that had never failed her, that had stood as a beacon against the darkness of her worst moments, flickered and dimmed. She gripped the hilt tighter, pouring her will into the blade, refusing to let it die. The light steadied a small sphere of defiant gold in an ocean of madness. Images flashed past her, or through her. She could not tell. Faces she did not recognize, speaking languages she had never heard. Worlds burning under alien suns. Creatures of nightmare wearing the shapes of angels. A golden throne and a figure upon it, rotting and eternal. The visions came too fast, too many. Each one a lifetime of context, compressed into a single moment of terrible understanding. She was being shown something. Or perhaps the storm was simply careless with the knowledge it carried, spilling secrets across her consciousness like wine across a table. She learned of an Imperium that spanned a galaxy, of humanity spread across more stars than she had ever imagined existed, of wars that had raged for 10,000 years, of gods that fed on suffering and faith twisted into weapons. Then she hit atmosphere. The transition was brutal. One moment formless chaos, the next gravity reasserting itself with vindictive force. She plummeted through clouds that smelled of sulfur and burning promethium, whatever that was. Her armor shrieked as friction heated the metal. Excalibur blazed bright again, its light carving a golden trail through the polluted sky. Below her, a world resolved itself from the haze. Cities built like mountains, metal spires reaching toward the heavens as if in supplication or defiance. But something was wrong. Smoke rose from 1,000 points. Fires painted the landscape in shades of orange and red. Even from this height, she could see the wrongness spreading across the urban sprawl like infection through flesh. She angled her descent instinct and training taking over where conscious thought had frozen. The ground rushed up to meet her. She struck the roof of a massive structure, some kind of industrial complex, judging by the pipes and towers. The impact created a crater. Rockcrete shattered. Metal screamed. She landed in a crouch, one hand braced against the broken surface, Excalibur held ready. The first thing she noticed was the smell. Death had a scent she knew well from battlefields long ago, but this was different. Sharper, more acrid, mixed with chemicals and burning plastics and something organic that made her stomach turn. She rose slowly, her eyes adjusting to the chaos around her. The city was dying. She stood atop what appeared to be some kind of commercial district, though the architecture was like nothing from her experience. Everything was built to a scale that dwarfed human proportions, as if those who designed it had forgotten that people needed to feel safe in the spaces they inhabited. The buildings were fortresses. The streets were canyons. Every surface was decorated with symbols she did not recognize, eagles and skulls and icons that spoke of grim purpose. Below in those canyon streets, people ran. Thousands of them. Civilians, she thought, though they wore strange clothes and their faces bore marks of a harder world than she remembered. They fled from something, their movements driven by pure terror. Parents carried children. The elderly stumbled and fell, and were sometimes helped up, sometimes left behind. The strong pushed past the weak. Desperation had stripped away whatever civilization usually provided. She saw what they fled from a moment later. The creatures boiled up from below like a tide of living nightmare. They moved on too many legs, their bodies armored in chitin that gleamed purple and black under the burning sky. Some were small, the size of dogs, scuttling across walls with impossible agility. Others were larger, tall as men, but hunched and predatory, their limbs ending in claws that could rend metal. And among them moved things that defied easy description, bioconstructs of tooth and claw, an alien purpose. Tyranids. Again the knowledge arrived, without context. A species from beyond the galaxy, a hunger-given form. They did not hate. They did not rage. They simply consumed, breaking down all biological matter and incorporating it into their endless swarm. Worlds fell to them not through conquest, but through digestion. One of the creatures, a warrior form standing perhaps 8 feet tall, caught a fleeing man. The civilian's scream cut short as the claws punched through his chest. The Tyranid lifted its prey, studying the dying human, with eyes that held no malice, only the cold assessment of biomass to be harvested. Artoria moved without thought. She leaped from her perch, Excalibur blazing to full brilliance in her grip. The distance was easily 50 feet, but her body remembered magics older than the sword itself. She fell like a meteor golden light trailing behind her, and struck the warrior form with the full weight of her descent, channeled through the blade. Excalibur's edge honed by the dreams of a world cut through the alien's carapace like parchment. The creature split from crown to groin, its bisected corpse tumbling in opposite directions. The golden light spread from the wound, consuming the flesh in a flash of purifying radiance. Where the Tyranid had stood, only ash remained. The dying man stared at her with eyes that could not comprehend what he was seeing. Then he expired, his last expression one of confusion rather than relief. Artoria had no time to grieve for him. The swarm had noticed her. They came at her like a wave. She met them with steel and light. Excalibur sang its old song, the blade remembering every battle it had ever fought. Her movements were economy itself, no wasted motion, each strike claiming a life. A hormigaunt leaped at her face. She sidestepped and took its head with a backhand cut. 2 more came from her flanks. She spun the blade, drawing a circle of light, and both creatures fell in pieces. The civilians had frozen, caught between their fleeing and this new impossibility. A woman in strange robes pointed at Artoria, her mouth moving in what might have been prayer or disbelief. Others were pulling out primitive-looking devices, capturing her image on some kind of recording equipment. She ignored them. Her attention was on the swarm. There were hundreds of the creatures, perhaps thousands, flowing through the streets like a living river. She could kill them one by one, but there were too many. She needed to shift the momentum, force them to retreat, or at least halt their advance. She planted Excalibur point first into the ground and reached for the blade's true power. The light that erupted from the sword was not mere illumination. It was concept made manifest. It was the crystallization of humanity's hopes and dreams, the wish for a king who could save them from darkness. The golden radiance exploded outward in a sphere of searing purity, sweeping across the street and the buildings and the swarm itself. The Tyranids caught in that light simply ceased to exist. No ash, no residue. They were there, and then they were not erased from reality by something they had no defense against. The wave of destruction carved a semicircle 100 yards across, leaving only scorched rockcrete and the faint smell of ozone. The surviving Tyranids fell back, their swarm intelligence, recognizing a threat it could not simply overwhelm. They retreated into the shadows between buildings, hissing and clicking in their alien language, reorganizing for another assault that would account for this new factor. Artoria pulled Excalibur from the ground. Her hands trembled. The blade's light had dimmed again, the weapon protesting the expenditure of power. She had used too much too quickly, still disoriented from the fall, uncertain of where she was or what she faced. Her breathing came hard. Sweat dampened her brow beneath her helm. Around her, the civilians remained frozen. Then one of them, a man in what looked like some kind of uniform, military perhaps, stepped forward. He carried a rifle that seemed crude compared to the weapons she vaguely remembered from the visions during her fall. His face was gaunt, marked by scars, and the unmistakable weariness of someone who had seen too much war. He opened his mouth to speak. Before he could, a new sound echoed through the street. Engines. Heavy engines, the deep rumble of large vehicles approaching. From the north came a convoy of armored transports, each emblazoned with the same eagle symbol she had seen on the buildings. The vehicles were brutalist in design, all angles and armor plating built for function rather than grace. They disgorged soldiers. Dozens of them, hundreds pouring into the street with the discipline of professional military. They wore flak armor and carried those same crude rifles. Their faces held the same exhausted grimness as the first man. They took positions with practiced efficiency, creating firing lines and overlapping fields of fire. An officer shouted orders in a language that should have been incomprehensible, but somehow resolved itself in her mind as coherent speech. The visions had done something to her planted knowledge she had not earned. She understood them. She knew they were called the Astra Militarum, the Imperial Guard, the mortal soldiers of an empire that had forgotten how to be merciful. They stared at her, some with awe, some with suspicion, most with the blank incomprehension of men who had stopped trying to understand the galaxy's cruelties and simply endured them. One soldier, younger than the rest, his face still holding some remnant of innocence, fell to his knees. His lips moved in prayer. The words were formal, ritualistic, directed at something called the God Emperor. He thought she was a saint, a messenger from his divine master sent to deliver them in their hour of need. Artoria wanted to correct him, wanted to explain that she was no messenger, no saint, merely a knight who had fallen from grace long ago and now found herself lost in a nightmare world. But her throat was dry, her voice lost in the chaos of the moment. Instead, she simply turned back toward the direction the Tyranids had retreated. They would return. Swarms always did. And these people, whoever they were, wherever she had fallen, needed protection. She raised Excalibur, the blade's light still dim, but present a defiant spark against the burning sky. The message was clear enough. She would stand. She would fight. That was what knights did even when kingdoms fell and causes were lost, and the world itself had become unrecognizable. Behind her, the officer began barking new orders. The soldiers moved to support her position, though she could sense their confusion. They did not know what to make of her. Neither warrior nor saint foreign, yet human-wielding power they recognized as supernatural, but could not classify. Above them all, the sky continued to burn. Smoke rose in pillars that merged with the clouds. Somewhere in the distance, something massive roared a sound that spoke of weapons larger than anything she had ever imagined. This war was not small. This war was planetary in scale, a conflict that would make the battles of Camelot seem like border skirmishes, and she had fallen into its heart. Artoria allowed herself one moment of weakness, one brief second, where the weight of everything pressed down on her shoulders. She was alone. Avalon was gone. Whatever world she had known had been left behind, perhaps forever. She stood in a place of ashes and desperation, surrounded by strangers who might revere her or fear her, or simply use her as another weapon in their endless grinding war. Then the moment passed. She straightened. Her grip on Excalibur firmed. The blade responded to her will, its light brightening a fraction enough to push back the shadows a few inches more. Somewhere in the ruins ahead, the Tyranids were regrouping. Somewhere above in orbit, perhaps those who commanded this world's defense were receiving reports of an anomaly, an unidentified warp manifestation appearing in the middle of a combat zone. Somewhere in the machinery of this vast Imperium, gears were beginning to turn, classifications being assigned, threat assessments being made. But for now, in this moment, there was only the street and the people behind her and the darkness ahead. There was only the choice that had defined her entire existence, made again in a new world, with new stakes, but the same fundamental question. Would she fight? Would she protect those who could not protect themselves? The answer had never changed. Not in Camelot, not in Avalon, not here in this burning city whose name she did not even know. She took her first step forward toward the shadows where the swarm waited. The soldiers behind her hesitated, then followed, their boots crunching on debris and ash. They did not know her name. They did not understand what she was. But they recognized the walk of someone moving toward death with eyes open, and some primal part of their warrior souls responded to that ancient call. The battle for Carmentis had only just begun, and at its center, burning like a small golden star against the gathering dark, a knight who should not exist prepared to write her legend in a galaxy that had forgotten how to hope. Excalibur blazed brighter, answering her resolve with light that cast away shadows and sent the Tyranids skittering back another precious few yards. It would not last. The light never did. But for now, for this moment, it was enough. She would fight. She would protect. She would stand until she could stand no more. It was all she had ever known how to do. Dawn came to Carmentis with the color of old blood. Artoria had not slept. Sleep seemed like a luxury from another life, something belonging to the person she had been before the fall. She stood on what remained of a transit platform, watching the sun struggle through layers of ash and chemical smoke. The light that reached the ground was filtered and wrong, casting everything in shades of rust and shadow. Around her, the city groaned like a dying beast. Fires still burned in the lower districts. The Tyrannid swarm had retreated after her display of power, but she could sense them in the depths, regrouping, feeding, growing. They had not been defeated, merely delayed. The soldiers of the Astra Militarum had established a perimeter during the night. They worked with the efficiency of men who had performed these tasks 1,000 times, setting up firing positions and laying wire and posting sentries at intervals that spoke of doctrine refined through countless battles. They moved around her with a mixture of reverence and uncertainty, never quite looking at her directly, but always aware of her presence. She had learned some of their names through observation. Captain Arvin Halleck commanded this particular company, a man in his 40s, whose face bore the deep lines of someone who had aged decades in the span of years. He carried himself with the careful dignity of an officer trying to maintain authority in circumstances that had long ago spiraled beyond anyone's control. His men respected him. She could see that, but the respect was tinged with pity. The younger soldier who had knelt before her was named Torvin. He could not have been more than 20 standard years, though the Imperium's method of measuring time still felt alien to her. He kept glancing in her direction when he thought she was not watching his expression caught between wonder and fear. She recognized the look. She had seen it on the faces of peasants in Camelot when they had first beheld their king. She wished he would stop. The first execution happened 2 hours after dawn. A soldier was dragged into the central square by 2 of his comrades. He was stripped of his armor, his flak vest removed, left standing in just the stained underlayer that all the guardsmen wore. His face was bruised, one eye swollen shut. He had been beaten before being brought here. Captain Halleck read the charges from a data slate. Desertion in the face of the enemy. Abandonment of post. Cowardice. The words were delivered in a flat tone, administrative rather than emotional. This was simply procedure, another task to be completed before the day's real work could begin. The condemned man did not protest. He stood with his head bowed, shoulders slumped in acceptance. Artoria wondered if he had known this was coming, if he had made his peace with it during the beating or before. Halleck drew his bolt pistol. The weapon was ceremonial, ornate, far too fine for actual combat. It was made for moments like this, for maintaining discipline, for reminding the living that service to the Imperium demanded everything and forgave nothing. Artoria stepped forward without thinking. Her hand moved toward Excalibur's hilt. Halleck noticed. His eyes met hers for the first time since her arrival, and in them, she saw a weariness that went beyond exhaustion. He was tired in his soul, she realized. Tired of giving these orders. Tired of pulling this trigger. Tired of being the instrument of an empire that consumed its own. He shook his head slowly. Not a command. A warning. Perhaps even a plea. She stopped. Her hand fell away from her sword. The logic was brutal but clear. This was not her command, not her army. She was a stranger here, an anomaly whose presence was tolerated only because she had proven useful. If she interfered now, she would undermine the authority that held these men together. And without that authority, the civilians behind them would have no protection at all. The bolt pistol spoke. The condemned man's head vanished in a spray of red mist and bone fragments. His body stood for a moment longer, as if uncertain it was dead, then collapsed. Blood pooled on the rock crete, adding one more stain to the thousands already there. The assembled soldiers barely reacted. A few made the sign of the Aquila across their chests, a religious gesture she had learned to recognize. Most simply returned to their tasks. They had seen this before. They would see it again. This was normalcy. 2 men came forward with a stretcher collecting the body with the practiced movements of undertakers. They would burn it, she assumed, or perhaps throw it into one of the mass graves that seemed to be standard practice here. The Imperium did not waste resources on funeral rites for the disgraced. Artoria felt something cold settle in her chest. She had killed men before, had ordered executions when justice demanded it. But there had always been ritual to its solemnity, an acknowledgement that taking a life was a grave act that diminished everyone involved. Here it was simply administration. A problem solved. A lesson delivered to those who remained. She turned away and found young Torvin watching her, waiting for her reaction, testing perhaps to see if the golden warrior who had descended from the sky would condemn them for their brutality, or accept it as necessary. She did neither. She simply walked past him, heading toward the eastern edge of the perimeter, where the civilian refugees had been gathered. There were perhaps 10,000 of them crammed into what had once been a commercial plaza. They huddled in family groups or alone, wrapped in whatever possessions they had managed to carry during the flight. Children cried with the exhausted wails of those who had been crying for days. The elderly sat in silence, their eyes glazed with shock. Some attempted to maintain normalcy, organizing what little food remained, rationing water from a broken fountain. She moved among them slowly, carefully trying not to draw attention. But her armor gleamed even in the dim light, an Excalibur at her hip was impossible to miss. Eyes followed her. Whispers spread through the crowd like ripples in water. A woman approached her, middle-aged, wearing the remnants of what had once been fine clothing, now torn and stained. Her face held the particular hardness of someone who had lost everything and decided to keep moving anyway. She bowed. The gesture was awkward, unpracticed, the kind of bow someone makes when they are unsure of protocol, but no deference is expected. Artoria waited. The woman seemed to be struggling with words, her mouth opening and closing. Finally, she managed to speak. Her question was simple, practical. Would there be food? Would they be safe? How long must they remain here? Artoria had no answers. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, when movement caught her eye. A child had separated from the crowd. A girl, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, rail-thin with dark hair matted against her skull. Her clothes were too large, hanging off her frame like rags on a scarecrow. But her eyes were alert, sharp, tracking everything with the wariness of someone who had learned that survival depended on constant vigilance. The girl walked directly toward her, ignoring the woman's startled warning. She stopped an arm's length away and stared up at Artoria with an expression of intense evaluation. Then she spoke. Her voice was rough, damaged, as if she had screamed herself raw at some point in the recent past. Her words were not a question. They were an accusation. "You are not from here." Artoria blinked. Of all the things she had expected, this directness from a child was not among them. The girl continued. Her tone never changed from that flat statement of fact. "You fell from the sky. You killed the monsters. But you do not know what you are doing. You do not understand this place." It was true. Artoria had no defense against it. The girl reached out and touched Excalibur's hilt. Her fingers traced the worn leather, feeling the age in the weapon. Then she looked back up at Artoria with something that might have been pity. "You think you can save us? You cannot. This place does not allow saving. It only allows dying slowly or dying fast." The woman rushed forward and grabbed the child, pulling her back with a stream of apologies. The girl did not resist, but her eyes never left Artoria's face. In them, the knight saw a reflection of the truth she had been trying to avoid since her arrival. She did not belong here. She did not understand the rules of this galaxy. And her presence, her power might make no difference at all against the systematic machinery of suffering that seemed to be this Imperium's foundation. The woman dragged the child away, still apologizing, still bowing. Artoria watched them go, feeling something she had not felt in a very long time. Helplessness. The day progressed with brutal efficiency. The Astra Militarum rotated shifts, half the men sleeping, while the other half maintained watch. Food was distributed to the civilians in portions that seemed deliberately calculated to keep them alive, but weak. Water was rationed with even more severity. When one man complained about the rations, he was struck across the face by a sergeant and told that the Emperor provided what the Emperor willed. No one else complained. Artoria observed it all. The casual cruelty, the acceptance of suffering as baseline, the way children learned not to cry too loudly lest they draw unwanted attention. She watched as the strong took from the weak, and no one intervened because that was simply how things worked. She saw sick people left to their fate because medical supplies were reserved for soldiers. She witnessed humanity at its most desperate, stripped of pretense, reduced to pure survival. And through it all, the symbols, the eagles, the skulls, the constant invocations of the God Emperor. The Imperium was not merely a government. It was a faith absolute and unquestioning. Every order was delivered as divine mandate. Every sacrifice was framed as holy duty. Suffering was not a failure, but a sacrament. She found herself thinking of Camelot. Her kingdom had not been perfect. There had been hardship and injustice, and moments when she had failed those who depended on her. But there had also been ideals. The attempt, however flawed, to build something better, to protect the weak, to hold back the darkness through something more than mere force. Here she saw only machinery. Human beings reduced to components in a vast engine that processed suffering into continuity. They called it civilization. They called it necessary. They called it the Emperor's will. She could not tell if they were right. By mid-afternoon, reports came of another Tyrannid probe in the southern sector. Captain Halleck mobilized a response team, 20 men with heavy weapons and faith in the Emperor's protection. Artoria moved to join them, grateful for the clarity of action after hours of observation. Halleck stopped her with a raised hand. He spoke carefully, choosing his words with obvious deliberation. She was valuable, he said, perhaps even holy. But she was also unknown. There were protocols for dealing with warp manifestations, even apparently beneficial ones. Until those protocols were satisfied, it would be better if she remained where she could be observed. The meaning was clear. She was not trusted. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. She could have insisted, could have simply walked past him and joined the fight anyway. But she remembered the execution that morning, the brutal practicality of maintaining order through fear. If she undermined Halleck's authority now, she might save 20 men in the south, but doom the 10,000 civilians behind her. So she stayed. And she watched as the response team deployed toward the sound of gunfire and screaming. And she did nothing. 3 hours later, 12 of the 20 men returned. The rest had been biomass for the swarm. That evening, as the rust-colored light faded into darkness, she found the girl again. The child sat alone on a broken piece of masonry, staring at nothing with those two old eyes. Artoria sat beside her. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, the girl's rough voice broke the silence. "My name is Lyria. I had parents. I had a home. The monsters took everything. The soldiers say the Emperor will save us. But I think the Emperor does not see us. We are too small." Artoria had no platitudes to offer, no reassurances. She simply sat with the child in the gathering dark, two figures united by the understanding that hope was a luxury they could not afford. Above them, the sky began to bruise with the colors of another storm. Not warp energy this time, just weather, just the natural violence of a world in its death throes. Somewhere in the city's depths, the Tyranids fed and grew. Somewhere in orbit, if she understood the visions correctly, there were ships and weapons and people who made decisions about which populations lived and which died. Somewhere in the machinery of the Imperium, her presence had been noted and classified and judged. But here on this broken plaza, there was only a knight and a child, sitting together in the dark, waiting for whatever came next. Lyria's small hand found hers. The child's fingers were cold, her grip weak. But she held on anyway, as if this contact with something that had shown kindness was the only anchor she had left. Artoria squeezed back, careful of her strength, and made a silent promise she had no idea how to keep. "I will not let you fall alone." The words were not spoken aloud. Perhaps Lyria heard them anyway. Or perhaps the child simply took comfort in the presence of someone who had not yet learned that caring was pointless. They sat together until the darkness was complete and the distant sound of screaming began again, and the war continued its grinding progress toward whatever bitter end awaited them all. The Voxcaster crackled to life 3 days after the fall. Artoria had learned to recognize the sound, that particular distortion of human voice through corrupted machinery. The soldiers stopped their tasks immediately, faces turning toward the battered device mounted on Captain Halleck's command chimera. Even the civilians in the plaza sensed the change, their constant background murmur falling to anxious silence. The voice that emerged from the speakers was cold, precise. Each word articulated with the careful enunciation of someone who expected absolute obedience. Inquisitor Marakov had arrived in the system. Artoria did not know what an Inquisitor was not truly. The visions during her fall had provided fragments, impressions of power and authority, and the absolute conviction that some prices were worth paying. But she understood hierarchy. She recognized the way Halleck's spine straightened, the way his hands moved to smooth his uniform, despite the futility of the gesture. This voice commanded even those who commanded others. The broadcast was brief. Tactical updates were being transmitted to all Imperial forces in Carmentis. New intelligence suggested the Tyranid swarm was larger than initially assessed. A splinter fleet, yes, but one that had burrowed deeper into the planet's infrastructure than orbital scans had detected. Estimates now placed the infestation at critical mass. Without immediate intervention, Helios 3 would be lost within weeks. Resources were being redistributed. Priorities were being reassessed. Some positions would be reinforced. Others would be abandoned. The list of grid coordinates to be evacuated scrolled across a data slate that Halleck studied with increasing tension. His jaw worked silently, teeth grinding. When he reached the final entry, his hand clenched tight enough that the slate's casing creaked. Dome 17 was to be abandoned. The words hung in the air like a curse, Around the command vehicle, soldiers exchanged glances. Some faces showed relief that their current position was not on the list. Others showed calculation, already planning the logistics of withdrawal. A few showed nothing at all, trained into emotional numbness by years of similar decisions. Artoria stepped closer to Halleck. She did not speak, merely waited until his eyes met hers. He turned the slate toward her. His finger traced a route on the tactical map. Dome 17 was 12 kilometers east, a refugee center established in the early days of the invasion. Population estimates ranged from 15 to 20,000, mostly civilians, elderly, children, the injured who could not be moved quickly. It had been designated a safe zone precisely because it was defensible, a converted industrial dome with thick walls and limited access points. Now those same features made it a trap. The Tyranids were converging on the dome from 3 directions. Halleck's finger sketched the enemy movements with mechanical precision. The swarm was using the undercity tunnels approaching beneath the surface, where orbital strikes and air support would be useless. By the time they emerged inside the dome's perimeter, the civilians would be surrounded. Evacuation was deemed impossible. The narrow access routes would create bottlenecks, where panicked crowds would crush themselves trying to flee. The Astra Militarum lacked the transport capacity to move 20,000 people before the swarm arrived. And even if they could move them, there was nowhere safe to take them. Every refuge was already overcrowded. Every defensive line was already stretched to breaking. So the decision had been made. The resources allocated to Dome 17 would be redirected to positions with better strategic value. The civilians would be left to their fate. Their sacrifice would buy time for others to be saved. It was logical. It was practical. It was the Imperium's way. Artoria felt something cold solidify in her chest. She asked a single question. Her voice was quiet, but every soldier within earshot heard it clearly. How long do they have? Halleck consulted the timeline on his slate. 48 hours. Maybe 60 if the swarm encountered resistance in the tunnels. After that, the Tyranids would emerge and the feeding would begin. She asked another question. What if someone held the access points? Bought time for evacuation. Halleck's expression was already forming the answer before she finished speaking. It would require troops he did not have, equipment that was needed elsewhere, support from command that would not be granted. And even if all those obstacles were overcome, the Inquisitor's orders were clear. Dome 17 was not a priority. Attempting to save it would be a waste of resources that might cost lives elsewhere. The math was brutal but simple. 20,000 lives against the possibility of saving 100,000. The Imperium had made such calculations for 10 millennia. The equation never changed. Artoria looked past Halleck toward the civilian plaza. Lyria sat where she always sat, on her broken piece of masonry, watching everything with those ancient eyes. The child had barely spoken since their first conversation, but she stayed close, orbiting Artoria like a small moon trapped in gravity. If Lyria was here, how many more like her were in Dome 17? How many children sitting in the dark, waiting for adults to save them, not understanding that salvation had been deemed too expensive? She turned back to Halleck and told him what she intended to do. His face went carefully blank. She recognized the expression. It was the same one he had worn before executing the deserter. The face of a man doing mathematics with human lives and hating every calculation. He could not order his men to accompany her. To do so would be direct violation of inquisitorial command. His career would end. His life would likely follow. and his company would be decimated for no gain because the Inquisitor was right. Dome 17 could not be held, not with any force Halleck could muster. But he could not stop her either. She was not under his command. She was barely even recognized as part of Imperial forces. She was an anomaly, useful but uncontrolled, tolerated only because she had proven her value. She asked if he would report her immediately. His jaw worked again. Then slowly he shook his head. The Voxcaster was experiencing interference. Solar flares, perhaps. Atmospheric disturbance from the fires. It might be several hours before communications were fully restored. These things happened in war zones. The lie was transparent. It was also a gift. Artoria nodded once, a gesture of respect between two people who understood duty even when they disagreed on its application. Then she turned and walked toward the edge of the perimeter. Lyria was there before she had gone 10 steps. The child said nothing, simply fell into step beside her, that same grim determination radiating from her small frame. When Artoria tried to send her back, Lyria's response was flat and unarguable. "You are going to die. I would rather die with you than alone here." There was no counter to such logic. Artoria had learned enough about this galaxy to know that children here grew old fast or did not grow old at all. Lyria had already made peace with mortality. Trying to protect her from it would be an insult to that hard-won acceptance. They left Carmentis as the sun reached its apex, that same rust-colored light casting everything in shades of dried blood. Behind them, the city continued its slow collapse. Ahead, the route to Dome 17 stretched across wasteland that had once been prosperous suburbs. The Imperium's infrastructure was built to last, but nothing lasted forever. Buildings that might have stood for centuries had been reduced to rubble by orbital bombardment and tyrannid bioweapons. Streets were torn open, revealing the layers of previous cities buried beneath. Everywhere she looked, Artoria saw the archaeology of failure civilizations. Built on the graves of civilizations, each one certain it would be the last, each one wrong. They moved through the ruins carefully. Lyria knew paths that avoided the worst debris shortcuts through buildings that still had enough structure to be safe. The child had the knowledge of survivors, the learned wisdom of those who navigated disaster as routine. Other refugees joined them as they traveled. Word had spread somehow, as it always did, in desperate populations. The Golden Warrior was moving east. The Saint was marching toward Dome 17. People emerged from hiding places, from cellars and sewers and the hollow shells of bombed-out buildings. They carried children and pulled carts loaded with whatever possessions they had salvaged. They followed without asking questions, because following someone who moved with purpose was better than waiting for death in isolation. By the time they reached the industrial district that surrounded Dome 17, their numbers had swollen to perhaps 300. Not enough to matter in any military sense. Just enough to be a burden that would slow her down when speed might mean survival. She did not send them away. The industrial district was a nightmare of rusted metal and toxic pools. Factories that had once processed raw materials into the components of empire now stood silent, their machine spirits dead or mad. Chemical fires burned in containment vessels that had long ago failed. The air tasted of corrosion and poison, each breath a small violence against living tissue. Spotlights found them as they crossed the final kilometer to the dome. Artoria looked up and saw them. Automated defense systems reactivated by someone with authority and purpose. The lights tracked their movement with mechanical precision, never wavering, never losing focus. She understood immediately. They were being watched, judged, every step recorded for later assessment. The Inquisition had eyes everywhere. She kept walking. The The civilians behind her kept following. What else could they do? Dome 17 rose from the wasteland like a cathedral to function. Its walls were 3 meters thick, reinforced rockcrete laced with adamantium struts. The entrance was a single massive door, designed to be sealed against everything from chemical weapons to nuclear fire. It should have been a fortress. Instead, it was a tomb, waiting to close. The refugees inside had heard rumors of the Golden Warrior. When Artoria entered, a crowd was waiting. Thousands of faces turned toward her, with expressions ranging from desperate hope to blank despair. They had been abandoned by the Imperium. They knew what that meant. But here was something that looked like salvation, even if salvation made no sense. An old man approached her. He wore the remnants of what had once been administrative clothing, marking him as someone who had held minor authority in whatever life he had led before the invasion. His face was gaunt, his hands trembled, but his voice was steady. He asked if she had come to save them. Artoria looked at him, at the thousands behind him, at the children clinging to parents who could not protect them, at the elderly who had survived everything only to be deemed expendable in their final hours, at Lyria standing beside her with that terrible knowing expression. She gave the only answer she could. "I will try." It was not a promise of success. It was barely even hope. But it was more than they had possessed a moment before. And in that context, it was everything. The old man began to weep, not with joy, with relief that anyone, had acknowledged their existence. That they would not die unmourned and unknown. That their last moments would have a witness. Artoria set the refugees to work immediately. The dome had supplies limited but present. There were still some able-bodied men and women who could fight if given weapons and direction. The automated defense systems could be manually controlled from a central hub. It was not much. It would not be enough. But it was something. She found the access points Halleck had mentioned, the sealed tunnels that connected to the Undercity network. 3 of them arranged in a triangle around the dome's perimeter. When the Tyranids came, they would emerge from those points simultaneously, creating multiple breaches that could not all be defended at once. So she would defend them all. It was tactically impossible. A single warrior, no matter how skilled, could not be in 3 places at once. The distances were too great. The response time would be too slow. By the time she reached one breach, the others would already be overrun. She prepared anyway. Because the alternative was to do nothing, and nothing was not an option her nature allowed. Lyria stayed close as she worked the child's presence, a constant reminder of what failure would cost. Sometimes the girl would touch Excalibur's hilt, those small fingers tracing the blade's crossguard, with something approaching reverence. She never asked questions. She simply observed learning, preparing herself for whatever came next. Night fell with the same rust-colored decay as every sunset. The civilians huddled in family groups or alone, trying to rest, trying to preserve strength for the flight or fight that awaited them. Some prayed to the god emperor. Others prayed to older gods or to no gods at all, simply sending their desperation into the void and hoping something listened. Artoria stood at the central access point. Excalibur drawn her eyes on the sealed door that would soon open. She had positioned the few soldiers she had been given at the other 2 points inadequate forces that would buy seconds at most. But seconds might be enough. Seconds might make the difference between total annihilation and merely catastrophic loss. The spotlight still tracked her, still watched. Somewhere above in orbit or in some command center, shielded from the horrors below. People were observing her choice, recording her disobedience. making their own calculations about what she represented and what threat she posed to their ordered galaxy. She found she did not care. Let them watch. Let them judge. Let them condemn her for choosing the wrong equation. She was not of this Imperium. She had never sworn to its emperor. She served only the ideal that had defined her entire existence, flawed and insufficient as it might be. Protect the weak. Stand against the darkness. Fight until you can fight no more. It was all she had. It would have to be enough. The first tremor came an hour before dawn. Subtle at first, barely noticeable. Then stronger. The ground shaking as something massive moved through the earth below. Artoria felt it through her boots, through her bones, through the connection that existed between a warrior and the battlefield. They were coming. She raised Excalibur. The blade blazed to life, golden light pushing back the shadows. Behind her, civilians began to stir their rest, broken by the trembling earth. Children cried. Adults whispered prayers. Somewhere in the darkness, Lyria watched with those eyes that had already seen too much. The sealed door began to buckle. Artoria planted her feet and prepared to do the impossible. To hold a line that could not be held. To save people who had been deemed unsavable. To stand against a tide that would inevitably overwhelm her. The door exploded inward in a shower of metal and chitin and nightmare. The Tyranids poured through the breach like water from a broken dam. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Their bodies packed so tightly they crushed each other in their eagerness to reach prey. Their shrieks filled the dome with sound that bypassed hearing and struck directly into the hindbrain, triggering every animal instinct that screamed to flee. Artoria did not flee. She met them with light and steel, Excalibur carving through alien flesh in arcs of pure destruction. Each strike claimed lives. Each movement was perfect economy, the distillation of centuries of practice into movements that wasted nothing. She became a storm of golden light in the darkness, a single point of defiance against the inevitable. But defiance did not equal victory. For every creature she killed, 3 more took its place. The swarm had no fear, no hesitation, no concept of retreat. They were hunger given form, and she was merely another resource to be consumed. Her arms began to ache. Her breath came harder. Excalibur's light flickered as she drew too deeply on its power too quickly. She was not in Avalon anymore. The blade could not draw on that realm's sustaining magics. Here it was only what she could give it, and she was finite. Behind her, the civilians were evacuating through the main entrance, fleeing into the wasteland because staying meant certain death. She could hear their footsteps, their panicked breathing, their desperate prayers. She held the line so they could run, buying them seconds, minutes, whatever time her body could purchase, with blood and pain. A warrior form broke through her guard. Its claws raked across her armor, scoring deep gouges in metal that had turned aside weapons for centuries. She felt ribs crack, tasted blood, spun and took the creature's head, but another was already there, and another and another. She could not hold. She could not save them all. She had known this from the beginning, but knowing and experiencing were different things. The truth of her failure crashed down with physical weight. She was strong, yes. Skilled, yes. But she was one warrior against an endless swarm, and mathematics did not care about heroism. Then she heard it. The sound of last fire from the other breach points. The deep cough of bolter rounds. The screams of men dying, but dying while fighting, not fleeing. Captain Halleck had come. She could not see him through the press of bodies and darkness, but she recognized the tactical discipline in the firing patterns. He had brought his company, or what remained of it. He had violated direct orders, sacrificed his career, and possibly his life to be here. To stand beside the strange warrior who had fallen from the sky and insisted that some equations were worth breaking. It still would not be enough. But it was something. And sometimes in the darkest moments, something was all the difference between dying on your knees and dying on your feet. Artoria screamed. Not words, just raw defiance given voice. Excalibur blazed brighter, fed by her fury and her desperate determination. She carved through the swarm with renewed strength, creating space, buying time, refusing to fall while people still needed her to stand. Above them all, the spotlights continued their mechanical vigil, recording everything, missing nothing. And somewhere in the machinery of the Imperium, a judgment was being rendered. A classification assigned, a threat level calculated. Heretic Alpha, termination required. But that was for later. For now, there was only the battle. Only the light and the darkness and the endless struggle between them. Only a knight and her sword, standing in the breach holding the line, because that was what knights did. Even when the line could not be held. Even when holding it meant damnation. Even when everything was already lost. The battle lasted 17 hours. Artoria lost track of time somewhere around the 4th hour when exhaustion became a constant companion rather than a creeping threat. Her world narrowed to the space immediately around her. The swing of her blade, the shriek of dying tyranids, the splatter of alien blood across her armor. Everything beyond that circle of violence ceased to have meaning. Excalibur had long since stopped blazing with its usual brilliance. The golden light had faded to a dim glow, barely enough to illuminate the next target. Each time she called upon its power, the response came slower, weaker, as if the blade itself was begging for rest. But rest meant death, and death meant the civilians still fleeing through the wasteland would be caught and consumed. So she fought. Her arms moved through forms burned into muscle memory over lifetimes. Cut, parry, thrust, pivot. Each movement precise despite the trembling in her limbs. Each strike calculated to conserve energy while still claiming lives. She had become a machine of violence, processing targets with the efficiency of the very Imperium she was defying. Around her, the Astra Militarum fought with the grim determination of men who knew they were already dead. Captain Halleck directed fire from a position near the central breach, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. His company had been reduced by half. Then 3/4. The survivors fought on, not because they believed in victory, but because dying well was all they had left to control. Young Torvin was among the dead. Artoria had seen him fall in the 8th hour, dragged down by a pack of hormagaunts that tore him apart before anyone could reach him. His last expression had been one of surprise, as if he had never truly believed death would find him, despite seeing it claim so many others. She had killed the creatures that took him. It changed nothing. The swarm kept coming. Wave after wave pulled from some inexhaustible reserve deep in the planet's crust. For every tyrannid that fell, 3 more scuttled over the corpse. The dome's floor had become a carpet of bodies, alien and human, mixed together in a grotesque tapestry of war's reality. Somewhere during the 14th hour, Artoria realized they had succeeded. The main civilian evacuation had completed. The refugees had fled into the wasteland, carrying with them whatever chance of survival the night would permit. Dome 17 was empty, except for the fighters holding the breaches and the swarm trying to overwhelm them. The mission was complete. They could withdraw. But withdrawal would mean abandoning the dome to the Tyranids, who would then pour through its now open entrances and pursue the fleeing civilians. The refugees would be caught in open ground, defenseless, easy prey. Everything they had fought for would become meaningless. So they stayed. And they died. One by one, two by two, the mathematics of attrition working against them with cold precision. Halleck fell during the 16th hour. A warrior form had broken through the eastern perimeter, moving too fast for aging reflexes to track. Its claws punched through his chest, emerging from his back in a spray of red. The captain looked down at the wound with something approaching curiosity, as if mildly interested in this new development. Then his eyes found Artoria across the killing floor. He smiled. It was not a happy expression, but it was genuine. A moment of satisfaction that he had chosen well. That his last act had been defiance rather than obedience. That he had remembered what it meant to be human rather than simply a cog in an empire's machinery. Then he died, and the machinery consumed him like it consumed everything. Artoria killed the warrior form. Killed everything around it. Killed until her vision blurred, and her arms could barely lift Excalibur, and her breath came in ragged gasps that tasted of blood and bile and exhaustion beyond anything she had ever experienced. The 17th hour brought silence. Not peace, not victory, just the sudden absence of enemies. The Tyranids withdrew, pulling back into the tunnels with the coordinated precision that marked them as something more than mere beasts. They were regrouping, reassessing. The swarm intelligence had determined that this particular assault was costing more resources than it was worth. They would return. But not yet. Not for a few hours at least. Artoria stood in the center of the dome, surrounded by corpses, and tried to remember why she was still standing. Her body wanted to collapse. Her mind wanted to shut down. Only will kept her upright, and even that was beginning to fray. Of Halleck's company, 7 men remained. They sat or lay scattered across the dome, their weapons empty, their armor cracked, their faces blank, with the shock that comes after survival feels more like curse than blessing. Lyria was there. The child had stayed throughout the entire battle, hiding in shadows, watching everything with those ancient eyes. She approached Artoria slowly, carefully, as if approaching a wounded Aniel that might lash out without meaning to. The girl's small hand touched Artoria's gauntlet. The contact was gentle, almost tentative. She said nothing. She did not need to. Her presence was message enough. You are still here. I am still here. We endure. Artoria wanted to tell her that endurance was not enough. That they had bought time but not salvation. That the Tyranids would return stronger, angrier, more determined. That the civilians they had saved would likely die anyway in the wasteland, picked off by other threats or simply succumbing to exposure and starvation. She wanted to explain that heroism was a children's story, and this galaxy had no place for such fairy tales. But her throat was too dry for speech, her tongue too thick. So she simply stood there, Lyria's hand on her armor, and tried to find the strength to move. That was when the sky opened. Not like before. Not with the chaotic violence of the warp storm that had brought her here. This was controlled, deliberate. Reality bent around a single point high above space folding, in ways that should not be possible, and through that fold something reached down with invisible fingers. The air pressure changed. Artoria's ears popped. Every surviving soldier looked up simultaneously, some animal instinct warning them that something worse than Tyranids was coming. The warp storm manifested directly above Dome 17. It was smaller than the one that had taken her from Avalon, but no less terrible. Colors that had no names bled across the sky. The laws of physics became suggestions. Time stuttered, moving forward and backward and sideways all at once. Artoria felt it immediately. The pull, the recognition. The warp knew her. She had passed through its realm. She carried its touch in her soul now, a mark that could never be fully scrubbed away. And it wanted her back. She tried to run. Her legs refused to obey. The warp's gravity was not physical, but psychic, pulling at her consciousness rather than her body. She felt herself being drawn upward, not through space, but through the layers of reality, peeling away from the material world, like skin from a wound. The visions began. Camelot appeared around her. Not the Camelot of its glory days, but the Camelot of its end. The throne room was empty except for bodies. Knights she had trained and trusted and failed. Lancelot stood among them, his face twisted with betrayal and rage. He spoke, but his mouth did not move. The words arrived directly into her mind. You chose the crown over us. You chose duty over love. You chose an ideal over people. And for what? To watch it all burn anyway? She tried to respond, to defend her choices, to explain that a king could not afford personal attachments, that the kingdom had to come first. That sacrifice was the price of leadership. But the words would not come. Because deep down in the part of herself she had tried to bury for centuries, she knew he was right. The scene shifted. Mordred appeared, that fatal child born of mistakes and magic, and a night Artoria had tried to forget. Mordred's eyes held nothing but hatred, the bitter resentment of someone who had wanted only acknowledgement and been given only rejection. You never even tried to understand me. I was your blood, and you treated me as a mistake to be hidden. Is it any wonder I destroyed everything you built? The accusation hit harder than any blade. Artoria had made so many mistakes with Mordred, had been so afraid of acknowledging her own failures, that she had created the very weapon that would bring her down. The irony was brutal in its perfection. Guinevere materialized next, beautiful and sad, and infinitely weary. The queen who had loved two men and been crushed between them. Her voice was softer than the others, but no less damning. You asked me to be an ideal rather than a person, to love a symbol rather than a human being. I tried. I failed. And that failure destroyed us all. Did you ever wonder if maybe you were the impossible standard, not us? The visions came faster now, overlapping a cascade of every failure and regret and moment of doubt that Artoria had accumulated across lifetimes. Every person she had failed to save, every promise she had broken, every ideal she had compromised in the name of greater goods that never quite materialized. The weight was unbearable. She felt herself cracking under it, the careful walls she had built around her guilt and shame crumbling like sand castles against a tide. And then the bombardment began. The first lance strike came without warning. A beam of coherent light that burned through atmosphere and struck the wasteland east of Dome 17 with the force of a fallen star. The impact vaporized everything within 100 meters. Rock turned to glass. Air turned to plasma. Human beings simply ceased to exist, their bodies converted to constituent atoms in a microsecond. The refugees. The civilians they had spent 17 hours saving. Gone. Artoria's consciousness snapped back to her body. The warp visions vanished, replaced by a reality somehow worse. She stood in the dome's entrance, Lyria still beside her, and watched as the orbital bombardment systematically erased every group of fleeing refugees. The strikes were precise, calculated. Each beam found a cluster of civilians and obliterated them with clinical efficiency. There was no malice in it, no rage, just the cold application of imperial doctrine. The refugees had been deemed contaminated by proximity to the tyrannid swarm. They could not be allowed to spread that contamination to other population centers. Therefore, they had to be cleansed. It was logical. It was practical. It was exactly what the Imperium always did. Artoria watched a family die. Parents shielding children. The beam found them anyway. For a moment, they were human beings with hopes and fears and love for each other. Then they were light. Then they were nothing. She watched the old man who had wept when she promised to try. His death was no different from the others. Instant, complete, mercifully brief in its execution, if not its implication. She watched hundreds die, thousands. The beams fell like rain, each drop a small apocalypse. The wasteland lit up with their impacts, a constellation of murder drawn across the earth. Lyria made a sound, not quite a scream, not quite a sob. Something between them, a noise that contained all the horror a child's voice could hold. The girl's hand tightened on Artoria's gauntlet, gripping so hard her knuckles went white. Artoria tried to move, tried to do something, anything. But what could she do against orbital weapons? How could she fight something she could not reach? She was a knight with a sword, and her enemies were firing from the sky. The helplessness was absolute. The last strike fell on a group that had almost reached the horizon. They had run further than the others, pushed beyond exhaustion by pure survival instinct. For a moment, Artoria thought they might escape, that the Inquisition might show mercy to those who had tried hardest. Then the beam found them, and they died like all the rest. Silence returned. The bombardment ceased as suddenly as it had begun. Mission accomplished. Contamination eliminated. Resources preserved for more strategically valuable operations. 20,000 lives reduced to statistics in a report. Artoria felt something inside her break. Not snap, not shatter. Breaking implied violence, a sudden trauma. This was slower. A structural failure that propagated through her entire being. Every support that had held her together, every principle that had sustained her through centuries of guilt and grief and endless trying, simply gave way. She had promised to save them. She had failed. Again, always. The pattern repeated across lifetimes. Different people, different worlds, different circumstances, but always the same result. She tried. She fought. She bled. And people died anyway, because her strength was never quite enough. Her speed was never quite fast enough. Her will was never quite sufficient to overcome the brutal mathematics of a universe that did not care about heroes. Excalibur slipped from her grip. The blade struck the ground with a sound like a bell tolling. Its light gutter dimmed, nearly died. The sword that had been her constant companion, the symbol of everything she had tried to be, lay in the dirt like discarded trash. Lyria was crying. Artoria could hear the child's quiet sobs, each one a small knife in what remained of her heart. The girl had seen her family die, had endured the invasion and the flight and the terror, had chosen to follow Artoria because she represented something better than abandonment. And Artoria had led her here to witness this, to understand that hope was a lie and salvation was a fairy tale, and the only truth was suffering, interrupted briefly by death. The warp storm pulsed above them, sensing opportunity. It had been trying to claim her before. Now it felt the cracks in her psyche, the fractures spreading through her sense of self. It reached down with renewed hunger, not to pull her away, but to pour itself into her, filling every broken space with its chaotic essence. She felt it entering her. Not painful, almost gentle, like cold water on burned skin. The warp offered what her failing will could not: strength, purpose, the power to make the universe pay attention. And underneath that offers something else. Something that had always been inside her, buried deep beneath layers of duty and discipline and the desperate need to be good. The instinct to destroy. Not rage, not hatred. Something purer and more primal. The animal recognition that when everything else fails, when all defenses crumble and all hope dies, there remains one final option. Burn it all down. Destroy everything that threatens. Kill until nothing remains that can hurt you or those you claim as yours. It was the logic of a cornered beast. The philosophy of last resorts, the mathematics of extinction. And in this moment, with the taste of ash on her tongue, and the sight of vaporized children burned into her retinas, and the sound of Lyria's sobs echoing in her skull, it made perfect sense. Her heart beat faster, not with fear, with something that felt like clarity. Every sound became sharper, every color more vivid. The world snapped into focus with terrible precision. She could feel the Tyranids in the tunnels below, feel their collective hunger, their simple drive to consume. They were a threat. They needed to be eliminated. She could sense the orbital platforms above, feel the weapons charging for another bombardment, ready to kill whatever moved. They had murdered 20,000 innocents. They needed to be punished. She could perceive the Imperium's machinery grinding on processing suffering into continuity, treating human lives as acceptable losses in equations where the only unacceptable outcome was mercy. It needed to be stopped. Everything needed to burn. The thought was so clear, so obvious, so right, that she almost surrendered to it completely. Almost let the instinct consume her, transforming her into a weapon of pure destruction that would solve every problem through overwhelming violence. Almost. Artoria's fingers closed around Excalibur's hilt. The blade was cracked. She could see the fractures spreading through the metal hairline fissures that spoke of fundamental damage. The weapon that had been whole for centuries was breaking just like her. But it was still hers. Still responded to her will. Still remembered who she had chosen to be, even if that choice had failed again and again. She pulled herself back from the edge, dragged her consciousness away from the seductive simplicity of destruction, fought against the instinct that promised relief through annihilation. Her voice came out as a whisper, raw, broken, but still hers. I will not become a monster. The warp laughed, not with malice, with pity, because monsters were not born. They were made. And she had already been made sculpted by centuries of failure and guilt and the impossible weight of trying to save everyone. She was not becoming a monster. She was finally admitting what she had always been. The transformation began. Golden light died. Violet darkness rose to take its place. Not the clean darkness of night, but something corrupted, stained wrong. It poured from Excalibur's cracks like blood from a wound, spreading across the blade, consuming its brightness, inverting its nature. Artoria felt her armor shift. The metal darkened, losing its brilliant sheen, taking on the color of burned things. Her hair, always bound in careful discipline, came loose, floating around her face in a halo of gold turned ashen. Inside her chest, something fundamental changed. The part of her that had tried so hard to be good, to be worthy to be the king her people deserved, simply gave up. Not died, not fled, just stopped fighting and let the darkness she had always denied rush in to fill the vacuum. She was still Artoria, still herself, but filtered through grief and rage and the terrible acknowledgement that kindness was weakness and mercy was failure. And the only truth worth believing was that the strong survived by crushing the weak. Excalibur Morgan emerged from the transformation. No longer a blade of light, but a sword of darkness. Its edge gleamed black drinking light rather than radiating it. Power thrummed through the weapon, but it was power without warmth, strength without compassion. It was the sword of someone who had given up on saving the world and settled for drowning it. Lyria stumbled backward, her small face twisted with confusion and fear. She did not understand what was happening. She only knew that the golden warrior who had protected her was changing into something that radiated cold menace instead of warm hope. Artoria looked down at the child, saw the fear in those ancient eyes, felt something that might have been regret if regret was still an emotion she could access fully. But regret changed nothing. Fear changed nothing. Hope changed nothing. Only power mattered. Only the ability to destroy threats before they destroyed you. That was the lesson this galaxy had been trying to teach her, and she had finally learned it. She raised Excalibur Morgan. The blade hummed with dark energy, eager to be used, hungry for the violence it was designed to inflict. Above the warp storm swirled, no longer trying to claim her. She was already claimed, already transformed, already lost to the things she had sworn never to become. Below, the Tyranids felt the change and pressed forward with renewed aggression, sensing wounded prey. Around her, the surviving soldiers of the Astra Militarum whispered prayers and took steps backward, recognizing predator instinct in their genetic memory. And at the center of it all stood Saber Alter, a knight who had fallen not from grace, but from hope, carrying a sword of darkness, and the absolute conviction that mercy was a luxury this universe did not permit. The darkness was complete. The light had died. And what remained was something the galaxy had not seen before and would learn to fear. A saint inverted, a hero twisted, a protector who had forgotten why she was protecting and remembered only how to kill. The second battle for Dome 17 was about to begin, and this time there would be no restraint, no mercy, no light at all. Only the dark and the blade and the cold satisfaction of destroying everything that threatened those she had claimed as hers, even if she had to burn the galaxy to ash to do it. The Tyranids came again at dawn. They poured from the breaches in a tide of chitin and fury, driven by the swarm intelligence's calculation that the defenders must be exhausted beyond recovery. The mathematics made sense. No force could sustain combat readiness after 17 hours of continuous fighting. The humans would be weak, slow, easy prey. The mathematics had not accounted for what stood waiting in the dome's center. Saber Alter did not move as the first wave approached. She stood perfectly still. Excalibur Morgan held loosely in one hand, its dark blade pointed toward the ground. Her posture spoke of absolute confidence or complete indifference. Perhaps both. The distinction no longer mattered. Behind her, the 7 surviving guardsmen had retreated to the far wall. Their weapons were raised, but their hands trembled. They did not know whether to fear the swarm or the thing that had been a golden warrior hours before, and was now something else entirely. Lyria had not moved. The child sat where she had collapsed after the transformation, her eyes fixed on Saber Alter's back, trying to reconcile the protector she had known with this creature of darkness. She wanted to flee. Her body refused to obey. Some part of her, the part that had survived through recognizing power dynamics, understood that running would only mark her as prey. The Hormagaunts reached Saber Alter first, a dozen of them moving with the speed that made them the swarm's shock troops. Their scything talons could open ceramite armor. Their jaws could crush through bone. They leaped as one, a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm through sheer simultaneous impact. Saber Alter moved, not with the flowing grace she had shown before. This was different, brutal. Each motion was economy reduced to violence. Her blade rose and fell with mechanical precision, bisecting creatures mid-leap. No wasted movement, no flourish, just the cold application of force to targets. The first Hormagaunt died before it understood it was dead. The second managed a shriek that cut short as its head separated from its body. The third through 12th simply ceased to exist, their bodies falling in pieces that had been whole a moment before. She had not moved her feet, had not shifted her stance, had simply turned at the waist, let her arm describe an arc, and ended 12 lives with less effort than drawing breath. The swarm hesitated. The collective intelligence recognized something wrong. The prey did not smell like prey anymore, did not move like prey. The bioelectrical patterns radiating from her were all wrong, inverted, dangerous in ways the swarm's genetic memory could not classify. Saber Alter raised Excalibur Morgan. The blade came alive with dark energy violet and black lightning crawling along its edge. She pointed it toward the largest concentration of Tyranids and spoke her first words since the transformation. Her voice was different, lower, colder. Each word fell like a stone into still water, creating ripples that spread through the dome's atmosphere. "You are in my way." It was not a threat, not anger, simply statement of fact. They occupied space she had decided belonged to her. That made them a problem. Problems required solutions. She swung the blade in a horizontal arc. The energy that erupted from Excalibur Morgan was not light. It was the absence of light, a wave of concentrated void that devoured everything in its path. The beam cut through the swarm like a scythe through wheat. Tyranids caught in its path did not die so much as stop existing, their biomass consumed by something that operated on principles beyond simple destruction. The wave continued past the dome's entrance, carving through the wasteland beyond, leaving a perfectly smooth trench 100 meters long and 3 meters deep. Everything within that space was gone, not vaporized, not scattered, simply removed from reality. Silence followed. Even the swarm's background chittering stopped the collective intelligence processing this new variable with something approaching confusion. Then Saber Alter walked forward. Her pace was unhurried, almost leisurely. She moved like someone taking a stroll through gardens rather than advancing into the heart of an alien swarm. Excalibur Morgan swung in lazy arcs, each strike claiming lives with the efficiency of industrial equipment. A warrior form lunged at her. She caught its claw mid-strike, her gauntleted hand closing around the blade like appendage, and pulled. The creature came apart, its limbs separating from its torso with sounds that should not have been possible from organic matter. She discarded the pieces and continued walking. The swarm tried to adjust, tried to adapt. That was what Tyranids did, what made them so dangerous. They learned. They evolved. They incorporated successful strategies and discarded failures with ruthless efficiency. But there was nothing to learn here. No pattern to exploit. No weakness to target. Saber Alter simply walked through their formations and ended them. When they attacked from multiple angles, she killed them all simultaneously. When they tried to overwhelm through numbers, she released another wave of void energy that erased hundreds. When they attempted to retreat and regroup, she pursued with patient inevitability. She was not fighting. She was exterminating. The distinction was important. A Carnifex, a living tank of muscle and armor and rage, emerged from the eastern breach. The creature stood twice her height, its biocannon already charging for a blast that could punch through armored vehicles. It had been held in reserve, waiting for the moment when its firepower would turn the tide. Saber Alter looked at it with the same expression she had shown the Hormagaunts. Mild annoyance at an obstacle's persistence. The Carnifex fired. The bioplasma bolt would have killed her instantly a day ago, when she had been concerned with things like survival and protecting her body from harm. She did not dodge, did not raise a guard. Simply swung Excalibur Morgan in an upward cut that met the plasma mid-flight. The blade split the energy, dividing it around her like water around a stone. The plasma splashed against the dome's walls, scoring rockcrete, but finding no flesh. Before the Carnifex could process this impossibility, she had closed the distance. Her next strike took the creature's leg at the knee. It toppled biology, unable to compensate for structural failure. She stepped onto its chest as it fell, her weight driving it down, and thrust Excalibur Morgan through its skull. The blade punched through armor that could turn aside anti-tank rounds, finding the brain cluster beneath. The Carnifex died without ceremony. She pulled her blade free and continued walking, leaving the corpse behind like discarded furniture. The swarm broke. Not retreated. Broke. The collective intelligence made a decision it rarely made, acknowledging that this particular prey was actually a predator, and continuing to engage would cost more biomass than could be harvested. The Tyranids fled back into their tunnels, abandoning their dead, abandoning the dome, fleeing from something that should not exist. Saber Alter watched them go. Did not pursue. They were no longer in her space, no longer threatening what she had claimed. That made them irrelevant. She turned back toward the dome. The surviving guardsmen were still pressed against the far wall, their expressions caught between awe and terror. They had witnessed a slaughter that violated every combat doctrine they knew. A single warrior had broken a Tyranid assault that should have overwhelmed a company. One of them, a sergeant whose name she had never learned, made the sign of the Aquila. His lips moved in prayer. Not thanks, not praise, propitiation. The kind of prayer offered to dangerous gods in hopes they would look elsewhere. Saber Alter paid them no attention. Her eyes found Lyria. The child had not moved, had barely breathed. She stared up at Saber Alter with an expression that contained no fear, only a terrible understanding. She recognized what had happened, had seen transformations before, had watched people change under the weight of this galaxy's cruelties. Saber Alter knelt before her. The motion was fluid-controlled, showing none of the exhaustion that should have followed such a battle. Up close, the changes were even more apparent. Her eyes, once vibrant with determination, were now cold as winter seas. Her face, always serious, but touched with humanity, was now a mask that showed nothing. She reached out and touched Lyria's cheek with one gauntleted finger. The gesture was almost gentle. Almost. Her voice when she spoke carried no warmth, but also no cruelty. Just flat statement. I kept my promise. You are alive. It was true. Technically. The child lived, that the golden warrior who had made the promise was gone. Replaced by this dark thing seemed to be a detail Saber Alter considered irrelevant. Lyria's response was barely audible. At what cost? The question hung between them. It was the right question, the only question that mattered. Victory was meaningless if it required becoming the very thing you fought against. Survival was pointless if it meant losing everything that made survival worthwhile. Saber Alter stood without answering. There was no answer. Or rather, the answer was written in the corpses behind her, in the dark blade at her side, in the cold emptiness where hope had once burned. The cost was everything, and she would pay it again without hesitation. She walked toward the dome's entrance, leaving Lyria behind. The child could follow or not, stay or flee, live or die. These were all choices Saber Alter no longer made for others. She had learned the lesson the Imperium tried to teach. People were responsible for their own survival. Trying to save them only led to watching them burn. Outside, the wasteland stretched toward Carmentis. The city was still burning, its fires visible even at this distance. Somewhere in that urban sprawl, the remains of Captain Halleck's original position would be holding or falling against whatever threats pressed them. Somewhere in the ruins, more civilians were dying slowly or quickly, their fates determined by mathematics they could not influence. And somewhere above in orbit, or in some facility shielded from the war's immediate consequences, the Inquisition was receiving reports. Unidentified combatant, warp manifestation, extreme threat level, capable of solo operations against major Tyranid formations, has displayed abilities consistent with demonic possession or major warp entity. Recommend immediate termination with extreme prejudice. Saber. Alter felt the weapons tracking her, felt the orbital platforms realigning their targeting systems, painting her with invisible beams. She had been marked, classified, judged as too dangerous to permit continued existence. She looked up at the sky, at the clouds that hid the void beyond, and felt nothing. No fear, no anger, just cold acknowledgement. They would try to kill her. She would kill them first, or they would succeed and she would die. Either outcome was acceptable. The only unacceptable option was caring. A sound behind her. Footsteps. Light. Hesitant. Lyria had chosen to follow. The child walked until she stood beside Saber Alter, looking up at the same sky, seeing the same invisible threats. Her voice was steady despite everything. Where do we go now? Saber Alter considered the question. Carmentis held nothing of value. The Astra Militarum positions would shoot her on sight either from fear or following orders. The civilian populations would flee from her darkness as readily as they would from Tyranid claws. There was nowhere to go. Nowhere that would welcome what she had become. She was anathema to the Imperium, an alien to its enemies. A creature without category or purpose, beyond the immediate satisfaction of keeping threats away from the small space she occupied. But Lyria was asking. And despite everything, despite the transformation and the darkness and the death of hope, some small part of Artoria's nature remained. Not the ideals, not the heroism, just the base instinct that had always driven her. Protect those who stand beside you. She pointed toward the north, where the wasteland gave way to rougher terrain. Hills and valleys where the war's infrastructure had not yet spread. Places where two people could disappear into the spaces between combat zones. There. It was not a destination, just a direction, away from the killing fields, away from the Imperium's machinery, away from everything except the basic requirement of continued existence. Lyria nodded and began walking. Saber Alter followed a pace behind Excalibur. Morgan held ready, her senses extended for threats. The two of them moved through the wasteland like ghosts, one small and fragile one radiating menace that made even scavenger animals flee. Behind them, Dome 17 stood empty except for corpses, a monument to the futility of trying, a reminder that heroism was a luxury and mercy was weakness, and the only truth that mattered was that the strong survived while the weak became biomass or statistics. Above them, the sky churned with potential violence. Lance strikes charging, drop pods being loaded, kill teams being briefed on a new target designated Heretic Alpha. The Imperium's vast machinery turning its attention toward a single individual who had dared to defy its calculations. Saber Alter felt their attention like pressure against her skin. Let them come. Let them try. She would show them what happened when you pushed someone past the point where death held any fear. She would show them what a saint looked like after the light died, and if the galaxy burned in the process, well. It had been burning when she arrived. At least now it would burn with purpose. They walked into the wasteland as the sun climbed toward noon. Two figures united by survival and separated by everything else heading nowhere, because nowhere was the only place left that would have them. The legend of the Black Saint had begun, and the galaxy would learn to fear her name spoken in whispers, carried on winds that smelled of ash and endings. Saber Alter, the knight who had forgotten how to save and remembered only how to kill. The light inverted, the hope extinguished, the darkness made flesh and given purpose. She walked north, and death walked beside her, patient and inevitable, and utterly without mercy, just as she had become. 3 weeks passed in the wasteland. Time moved differently now for Artoria. Not faster or slower, but with a quality of irrelevance. Days blurred together, distinguished only by which threats emerged and which were eliminated. The sun rose and set. The sky churned with storms, both natural and unnatural. The war ground on with its mechanical inevitability. She existed in the spaces between. The gaps in the Imperium's infrastructure where authority was too distant to enforce its will and too weak to protect its subjects. The forgotten places where people fell through administrative cracks and survived or died based on factors the official equations never accounted for. Lyria stayed with her. The child had become a shadow following 3 paces behind. Never speaking unless necessary, her presence a constant weight that Saber Alter neither encouraged nor dismissed. Sometimes at night, when exhaustion finally forced the girl to sleep, Artoria would watch her and feel something that might have been regret trying to surface through the cold. It never fully emerged. The feeling would touch the edges of her consciousness and then dissipate, unable to find purchase in the frozen landscape of what her heart had become. The first refugee camp they found was dying when they arrived. It sprawled across a valley between 2 industrial ruins, perhaps 500 souls clustered around a contaminated water source. They had been there for weeks, based on the established patterns of waste and makeshift shelters, cut off from Imperial supply lines, too small to warrant rescue, too large to hide effectively. The Chaos cultists had found them 2 days before Saber Alter did. She could smell the corruption from a kilometer away. Not with her nose, but with something deeper, a sense that had awakened with the transformation. The warp left traces, changed the texture of reality in ways she could now perceive. The cultists had been conducting rituals, trying to open a minor rift, using the refugees as sacrifices to power their profane mathematics. They had succeeded partially. A tear in reality flickered at the valley's center. small and unstable, but enough to allow lesser demons to claw their way through. The creatures were feeding on the refugees when Saber Altar arrived, their forms shifting between states of matter, never quite solid, never quite ephemeral. She did not announce herself, did not call out warnings or demands for surrender. Simply walked into the valley with Excalibur Morgan drawn and began killing. The cultists died first. They had expected many things when they pledged themselves to the ruinous powers. Damnation, certainly. Transcendence, possibly. What they had not expected was to be cut down with the efficiency of someone processing paperwork. Their mutations and blessings meant nothing against a blade that operated on principles beyond simple materialism. The demons took longer. They could not be killed in conventional terms, only banished back to the realm from which they had emerged. But Excalibur Morgan's void energy accomplished that, with the same brutal efficiency it applied to everything else. The creatures shrieked as they were unmade, their essence scattered across dimensions, denied even the satisfaction of a proper defeat. The rift collapsed. Reality sealed itself with a sound like tearing fabric played backwards. Silence returned to the valley, broken only by the terrified breathing of refugees who had expected death and received something they could not classify. Saber Altar cleaned her blade on a cultist's robe and walked through the camp. The refugees shrank from her approach, recognizing predator, even when the predator killed in their defense. They had learned that salvation came with prices, and sometimes those prices were worse than the threats they supposedly escaped. She found the wounded clustered in what passed for a medical tent. 30 or more injuries ranging from minor cuts to mortal wounds that were simply being managed until death arrived. No supplies for proper treatment. No trained personnel. Just other refugees doing their best with torn cloth and contaminated water and desperate hope. Saber Altar studied them with the detachment of someone assessing resources. These people could not travel, could not flee, would die if left alone and die if moved too quickly. The logical solution was to leave them. Waste no time on problems without viable solutions. She stayed anyway, not from compassion. That had died with the golden light, but from the same base instinct that kept her tolerating Lyria's presence. The damaged stayed near her because leaving them meant accepting that everything had been for nothing, that the transformation had been pure loss without even the consolation of functioning purpose. So she made camp at the valley's edge and waited for what she could not have said. But she waited nonetheless. Word spread. Refugees had networks invisible to Imperial authority. Information passed through them with speed that defied official communications infrastructure. Within days, other groups began arriving at the valley, families fleeing the fighting, survivors of massacres, both Xenos and Imperial, children separated from parents, the elderly who could not keep pace with military evacuations. They came because they had heard rumors, whispers of a dark saint who killed monsters, a warrior in black who protected the spaces between without demanding faith or tribute or conscription. They came with nothing to offer except their continued existence and the hope that existence might be permitted. Saber Altar did not turn them away, did not welcome them either, simply established a perimeter and killed anything that threatened to cross it. The Tyranids came first. A small tendril of the greater swarm, perhaps 200 organisms ranging from the smallest rippers to a pair of warrior forms. They approached the valley with the patient inevitability of their kind, drawn by the concentration of biomass. She met them at the valley's entrance and did not let them pass. The battle lasted 3 hours. No tactics, no strategy. Just her blade against their numbers, mathematics played out in blood and corpses. When it ended, the valley's approach was carpeted with bodies that would feed nothing. their biological matter corrupted by Excalibur Morgan's void energy into substances that even Tyrannid digestion could not process. The survivors added her kill to their growing collection of stories. The Black Saint who fought alone, who needed no support, who stood between them and death with the immovable finality of a mountain range. Imperial forces came next. A patrol from the Astra Militarum, 20 men in a Chimera transport sent to clear the valley of refugee populations that were deemed vectors for potential contamination. They arrived with flamers and orders to sterilize. Standard procedure. Regrettable, but necessary. Saber Altar stood in their path. The sergeant in command tried negotiation first, explained the orders. The logic. The mathematics that made killing 500 now better than risking 50,000 later. He was not cruel, not sadistic, simply a man doing his duty as he understood it, following doctrine that had kept humanity alive for 10,000 years. She listened in silence, then raised Excalibur Morgan. The message was clear enough. The sergeant had two choices: withdraw or attack. She would not move, would not compromise, would not accept the equation that said these lives were acceptable losses. He chose to withdraw. Perhaps he recognized something in her stance that reminded him of legends. Perhaps he simply calculated that his 20 men would not be enough against whatever she had become. Perhaps he was just tired of killing and grateful for an excuse to stop. The refugees watched him leave and understood what it meant. The Imperium would return, in greater numbers, with heavier weapons, with the absolute conviction that disobedience could not be tolerated, no matter how righteous it appeared. They understood and stayed anyway, because there was nowhere else to go. The pattern repeated across weeks. Threats emerged. Saber Altar eliminated them. More refugees arrived. The camp grew from 500 to 800 to over 1,000. The valley became a known quantity, a place whispered about in the spaces between combat zones. The Black Saint's Refuge, where the forgotten gathered, where the Imperium's mathematics failed. But mathematics never truly failed. They simply required time to complete their equations. Saber Altar felt the change before she saw it, a sensation like pressure building behind her eyes. A taste in the air that spoke of reality wearing thin. She had been using Excalibur Morgan, constantly channeling its void energy against threat after threat, drawing on powers that demanded prices, even if those prices were not immediately apparent. The warp was claiming its due. It started small. Moments where she would be standing in one location and blink to find herself several meters distant without memory of moving. Instances where time seemed to stutter seconds, repeating or vanishing entirely. Her reflection in water, showing someone who was her but also not the image, slightly out of phase with physical reality. Lyria noticed. The child watched with those ancient eyes, tracking each incident, cataloging evidence of deterioration. She said nothing. What was there to say? They both understood what was happening. The transformation had opened doors that could not be easily closed. The warp had touched Saber Altar, and now it was pulling her deeper. At night, when Artoria tried to rest, she would find herself partially translated into the Imperium. Her consciousness would drift between the material realm and that churning sea of emotion and thought that lay beneath. She would see the camp from impossible angles. See the refugees as glowing collections of psychic energy rather than flesh and blood. See the demons that prowled the boundaries of reality, hungry and patient, waiting for the barriers to weaken further. The instinct to destroy would resurface during these episodes. Stronger each time, more insistent. It would whisper that the solution to all threats was simple: total annihilation. Burn the valley. Kill the refugees. Eliminate every variable. Reduce everything to ash and silence, where nothing could threaten or disappoint or fail. She would fight it back down, would force herself to return fully to the material realm, would grip Excalibur Morgan until her hands ached and use the pain to anchor herself to reality. But each time was harder. Each episode lasted longer. The warp was patient and hungry, and it had marked her as its own. The Inquisition's forces arrived on the 22nd day. Not a patrol, not a clearing operation, a kill team. 6 warriors in power armor bearing the symbol of the Ordo Hereticus. They came with plasma weapons and melta-bombs and the absolute conviction that they were humanity's necessary blade cutting away corruption before it could metastasize. They did not try negotiation, did not offer surrender, simply opened fire from maximum range, trying to eliminate the threat before it could respond. Saber Alter felt the plasma bolts coming, felt them the way she felt everything now, as disturbances in the fabric of space-time. She moved between the shots, her body phasing partially into the warp, existing in multiple locations simultaneously for the microseconds required to avoid death. She closed the distance in seconds that felt like hours, her perception of time stretched and warped by her increasing disconnect from baseline reality. The first warrior died before he could adjust his aim. Excalibur Morgan punching through his ceramite breastplate as if it were cloth. The others tried to adapt, tried to account for an enemy who could exist in multiple states simultaneously. One of them managed to land a plasma bolt that burned through her shoulder. She felt it like a distant thing, pain processed, but not quite real, her body half in the Imperium and half elsewhere. She killed him for that. Killed all of them. Not with the cold efficiency she had shown before, but with something approaching rage. Though rage filtered through the lens of what she had become was more like a natural disaster given human form. When the battle ended, her armor was scored and burned. Blood, her own and theirs, painted her like ritual markings. She stood among the bodies and felt reality wavering around her, the boundaries between realms growing thinner with each use of her power. Lyria approached slowly. The child carried a cloth torn from someone's shirt. She did not try to touch Saber Alter directly, simply held out the cloth in silent offering. Artoria took it, cleaned her blade with mechanical motions. The ritual helped, gave her something concrete to focus on, something that belonged purely to the material world rather than the shifting nightmare the warp represented. She managed to speak. Her voice sounded strange in her own ears, as if arriving from a distance. How long, Lyria understood the question. Not how long until the next attack, but how long until Artoria disappeared entirely into the warp. How long until the transformation became irreversible and the knight who had tried to protect them vanished into the Imperium. The child's response was honest. Brutal, but honest. Days. Maybe less. They looked at each other in the dying light. The warrior and the child. The protector and the protected. United by the understanding that their time was measured in hours rather than infinity. Artoria wanted to rage against it. Wanted to fight the inevitability with the same determination she had fought every other threat. But she was tired. Not physically. Physically, she was stronger than ever, empowered by energies that normal humans could not channel. But spiritually, in the core of what remained of her identity, she was tired of fighting, tired of watching things fall apart despite her best efforts. tired of being ground down by a galaxy that did not care about heroes or ideals, or the desperate attempts of one warrior to make any difference at all. Lyria took her hand. The child's fingers were warm, real anchored in the material world in a way Artoria no longer quite managed. The contact helped, reminded her that she still existed in the here and now, even if that existence was temporary. They stood together as darkness fell completely. Around them, the refugee camp settled into its nightly routine. Fires were lit, meals were shared. Children laughed despite everything, because children could find joy in the smallest spaces between horrors. Above, the stars were wrong. Artoria could see that now with her warp-touched vision, could see the way reality bent and twisted, the way the Imperium pressed against the material realm, the way everything was always moments from tearing apart. She wondered if this was what going mad felt like, this gradual realization that the world everyone else saw was just the thinnest membrane over something vast and terrible and utterly without mercy. Or perhaps she was finally seeing clearly for the first time. Perhaps sanity was the illusion, and this nightmare was the truth everyone spent their lives trying not to perceive. The instinct to destroy whispered again, softer this time, almost gentle. It did not demand. It simply suggested that there was a way to end the pain, a way to stop the slow dissolution, a way to ensure that when she vanished into the warp, she would take everything with her. One final act, one last defiance. Burn it all and let the darkness have its victory. She considered it for longer than she should have. Then Lyria squeezed her hand, and the moment passed. Not yet. Not while there was still something to protect. Not while the small, warm pressure of a child's hand could still anchor her to reality. Not while she could still choose, even if that choice was simply to endure one more day. They stood in the darkness, two figures against the infinite, and waited for whatever came next. The legend of the Black Saint continued to spread. Refugees whispered her name. The Imperium added her kills to her file. The warp pulled at her soul with increasing hunger. But for now, in this moment, she stood. She protected. She held the line. Even if the line was being drawn in sand and the tide was rising. Even if everything she defended would eventually fall anyway. Even if she was already lost and simply refused to acknowledge it. She stood because it was all she remembered how to do. And sometimes in the smallest hours before dawn, that was almost enough.